The courtroom was tense. The air felt heavy, as if every breath carried the weight of what was about to happen. The judge sat stern-faced, the jury watched closely, and the spectators whispered among themselves. At the center of it all was a young boy, no older than 12, standing quietly beside his lawyer. His small frame seemed out of place in such a serious setting, but his eyes held a strength that surprised everyone. The case had been going on for weeks. The boy's family had been fighting for justice after a terrible incident that had shaken their lives. The details were painful, a moment of misunderstanding that had spiraled into something much worse. The boy had been there when it happened, and today, he was finally given the chance to speak. As the prosecutor finished his questions, the boy's lawyer gently encouraged him to share his side of the story. The boy took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. Then, without warning, he turned and pointed straight at one of the police officers sitting in the room. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The officer's face went pale. No one had expected this. The boy's voice was soft but clear as he spoke. "That's the man who helped me when no one else did." Silence. The room froze. Even the judge leaned forward, unsure if he had heard correctly. The officer, who had been sitting stiffly in his uniform, looked stunned. His stern expression softened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might speak, but no words came. The boy continued, his words spilling out like he had been holding them in for too long. "That night, when everything was scary, and I didn't know what to do, he was the one who stayed with me. He didn't have to, but he did." A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't what they had expected. The case had been painted as a clear-cut matter of right and wrong, but the boy's words changed everything. The officer lowered his head, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. No one had ever thanked him, not like this. Not in front of everyone. The boy's lawyer placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, letting him know it was okay to keep going. And so, he did. He told the courtroom about that night, the fear, the confusion, and the moment when this officer, instead of turning away, had knelt down to his level and promised he wouldn't leave him alone. By the time the boy finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the toughest-looking jurors blinked back tears. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the proceedings, but the emotion was undeniable. No one had seen this coming. The boy's words had flipped the entire case on its head. What had seemed like a simple story of blame had suddenly become something much deeper, a story of unexpected kindness in the middle of chaos. As the boy sat back down, the courtroom remained silent, still processing what had just happened. The officer wiped his eyes quickly, trying to stay composed, but the impact was clear. This was only the beginning. The boy's courage had changed everything. And no one would forget his words, not for a long time. The silence in the courtroom stretched for what felt like an eternity. The boy's words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Even the judge, usually composed and unshakable, took a moment before speaking again. He adjusted his glasses and glanced at the officer the boy had pointed to, the man who, until now, had been just another face in the crowd. The prosecutor, caught off guard, shuffled his papers nervously. He had prepared for arguments, for evidence, for witnesses, but not for this. Not for a child's raw honesty that cut through the legal formalities like a knife. The officer, still seated, kept his eyes fixed on the floor. His jaw was tight, but his hands, resting on his knees, trembled slightly. He had been in uniform for over a decade, seen countless cases, but none had ever turned like this. The judge finally broke the silence. "Young man," he said, his voice softer than before, "would you like to tell us more about what happened that night?" The boy nodded. He wasn't used to speaking in front of so many people, but the memory of that night was clear in his mind. He took another deep breath and began. "It was raining," he said. "Really hard. I was walking home from my friend's house when I heard shouting. Then, there were flashing lights. Police cars everywhere. He paused, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve. I got scared. I didn't know what was happening. I just stood there, frozen. Then someone yelled, and I ran. I didn't mean to, but I did. A few jurors exchanged glances. This wasn't the story they had heard before. The boy continued. I tripped and fell. My hands were scraped, and my clothes were muddy. I thought I was in trouble. His voice wavered, but he kept going. But then he came. He pointed at the officer again. He didn't shout. He didn't grab me. He just knelt down and asked if I was okay. The officer's throat tightened. He remembered that night too. The call had been about a suspected burglary, a false alarm, as it turned out. But in the chaos, he had seen a small figure darting away, terrified. He hadn't thought twice before going after him, not to arrest him, but to make sure he was safe. The boy's voice grew stronger as he spoke. He gave me his jacket because I was shivering. He called my parents so they wouldn't worry. And he stayed with me until they came. He looked directly at the officer. You told me everything would be all right. And it was. A quiet sniffle came from the back of the courtroom. One of the spectators, a woman in a blue dress, dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Even the court reporter, who usually typed without reaction, blinked rapidly. The prosecutor, realizing the shift in the room, stood up slowly. Your Honor, perhaps we should take a short recess. The judge considered it, then shook his head. No. I think we need to hear the rest of this. He turned back to the boy. Son, is there anything else you'd like to say? The boy hesitated, then nodded. People keep saying bad things about the police. And some of it's true. But not all of them. His eyes flickered toward the officer. He was good to me. And I don't want him to get in trouble because of me. The officer's breath hitched. He had been prepared for anger, for accusations, but not gratitude. Not this. The judge leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. The case had started as a straightforward legal matter, but now it had become something else entirely, a reminder that behind every law, every report, every headline, there were real people. And sometimes, the truth wasn't as simple as it seemed. As the boy stepped down from the stand, the courtroom remained silent, but the weight of his words lingered. The officer finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting the boy's for the first time since the testimony began. No words passed between them. None were needed. The tension in the courtroom had shifted. Where there was once an air of rigid formality, now there was something quieter, something human. The boy's words had peeled back the layers of procedure and politics, revealing the raw truth underneath. As the boy returned to his seat, his mother reached over and squeezed his hand tightly. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she gave him a small, proud smile. She had been afraid to let him testify, afraid the courtroom would be too harsh, too cold. But he had done what she couldn't, he had made them all listen. The judge cleared his throat and turned to the officer. Officer, he said, his tone measured but not unkind, would you like to respond to what we've just heard? All eyes turned to the man in uniform. He sat still for a moment, then slowly rose to his feet. His usual confidence was gone, his shoulders weren't squared, his voice wasn't firm. When he spoke, it was barely above a whisper. I remember that night, he admitted. But I didn't realize, he stopped, swallowing hard. I didn't realize he remembered it too. The prosecutor frowned. Officer, are you saying you did interact with the boy that evening? The officer nodded. Yes. But not the way people think. He took a deep breath. The call came in as a possible break-in. When we arrived, there was a lot of confusion, lights, shouting, people running. Then I saw him. He gestured toward the boy. Just a kid, standing there in the rain, looking terrified. So I went to him. He paused, as if replaying the memory in his mind. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know about any of this. His voice grew steadier. I just saw a scared child, and I did what anyone should do. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't part of the official report. This wasn't part of the narrative they had built. The judge steepled his fingers. Officer, why wasn't this mentioned before? The officer hesitated. It didn't seem relevant. It was just a few minutes of my shift. I didn't even file a report about it. He glanced at the boy. I didn't know it mattered. The boy's lawyer stood abruptly. With all due respect, Your Honor, it does matter. Because it shows that the situation wasn't as black and white as it's been portrayed. There was fear, yes, but there was also kindness. And that changes everything. The judge nodded slowly. Then, to everyone's surprise, he turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to take a step back. This case was brought before us as a simple matter of right and wrong. But what we're hearing today suggests it's far more complicated than that. One of the jurors, an older man with silver hair, spoke up. Your Honor, if I may, what the boy said, it makes you think. About how quick we are to judge. About how sometimes, the real story isn't the one being told. A few others nodded in agreement. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. The prosecutor, sensing the tide turning, stood quickly. Your Honor, I must object. This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the facts of the case. We're here to discuss the law, not emotional anecdotes. The judge raised an eyebrow. The law exists to serve people, counselor. And sometimes, understanding those people is just as important as understanding the statutes. He sighed. I think we've heard enough for today. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. As the gavel came down, the room erupted into hushed conversations. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, spectators whispered to each other, and the boy's family huddled close, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and cautious hope. The officer lingered near his seat, watching as the boy was led out of the courtroom by his parents. For the first time in a long time, he wondered if he had spent so much time enforcing the law that he'd forgotten why he'd signed up in the first place. And outside, as the boy stepped into the sunlight, he looked back, just once, and gave the officer a small, hesitant wave. The officer, against all protocol, waved back. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows as people filed back in for the next day of proceedings. The energy was different now, less like a tense legal battle, more like a gathering of people who had just realized they didn't have the full story. Reporters whispered in the back rows, jurors exchanged thoughtful glances, and even the bailiff seemed less rigid than before. The boy sat between his parents again, his legs swinging slightly under the bench. He didn't fully understand all the legal talk, but he could feel the shift in the room. Something had changed because of what he'd said. The judge entered, and everyone rose. He surveyed the courtroom with a measured gaze before sitting down. Before we resume, he said, I'd like to address something. He paused, choosing his words carefully. This case has taken an unexpected turn. And in the interest of justice, I believe we need to hear from one more person. He turned toward the back of the room. Officer, would you please take the stand? A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. The officer, who had been sitting stiffly in his usual spot, blinked in shock. Testifying wasn't part of his role, he was just there as a witness to the original incident. But the judge's tone left no room for argument. Slowly, the officer stood and made his way to the witness stand. The squeak of his shoes against the floor was the only sound in the silent room. He sat down, adjusted his collar, and swore to tell the truth. The judge nodded to the boy's lawyer. You may proceed. The lawyer approached, his expression calm but intent. "Officer," he began, "you heard the boy's testimony yesterday. You heard him describe how you helped him that night. Is that account accurate?" The officer's throat felt dry. He glanced at the boy, then back at the lawyer. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is. Did you, at any point, consider that your actions that night might have a lasting impact on him?" The officer hesitated. "No. I was just doing my job." The lawyer tilted his head. "But isn't protecting people, especially children, part of that job?" "Of course it is," the officer said, his voice firmer now. "But that night wasn't about me. It was about making sure he was safe." The lawyer let that hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "Officer, in your years of service, how often do you think people remember the good interactions with police? The moments where you helped instead of punished?" The courtroom held its breath. The officer looked down at his hands. "Not enough," he admitted. "People remember the bad. The scary. The times things went wrong." He exhaled sharply. "And sometimes, so do we." A murmur spread through the room. The prosecutor shifted in his seat but didn't object. The lawyer pressed on. "After that night, did you ever wonder what happened to the boy?" The officer's shoulders slumped slightly. "I did. But I figured, he'd forget about me. Kids move on." The boy, listening intently, shook his head slightly. "No," he thought. "I didn't forget." The lawyer turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." The prosecutor stood, his expression unreadable. He walked toward the witness stand, but instead of launching into a cross-examination, he simply asked, "Officer, if you could go back to that night, would you do anything differently?" The officer didn't hesitate. "No. I'd do the same thing again." The prosecutor nodded, almost to himself. Then, to everyone's shock, he said, "No further questions." The judge leaned forward. "Officer, you're excused. But I'd like you to remain in the courtroom." As the officer returned to his seat, the judge addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm going to give you an unusual instruction. Today, I want you to consider not just the law, but the human element of this case. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about understanding. And sometimes, understanding requires us to listen to stories like the one we've heard here." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We'll reconvene after lunch for closing arguments." As the court adjourned, the boy's mother pulled him into a tight hug. Nearby, the officer stood alone, staring at the floor. Then, hesitantly, the boy broke away from his mother and walked over to him. The officer looked up, startled. The boy didn't say anything. He just held out a small, folded piece of paper. The officer took it, hands unsteady, and opened it. In uneven, childlike handwriting, it read, "Thank you for being nice when I was scared." The officer's vision blurred. The officer stared at the note, the words blurring as his eyes stung. He blinked hard, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, but the boy had already turned and hurried back to his parents. The folded paper felt heavy in his hand. Around him, the courtroom buzzed with movement as people filed out for the lunch recess. A few glanced his way, their expressions unreadable. He barely noticed. His mind was stuck on two thoughts. He remembered me. Anne. I didn't even know his name. The boy's family sat on a bench outside the courthouse, sharing a packed lunch. His mother smoothed his hair, her voice soft. "You did so good in there, Mijo. So brave." The boy picked at his sandwich. "Is the officer in trouble because of me?" His father exchanged a glance with his mother before answering. "No, Iho. You told the truth. That's never wrong. But what if they don't believe me?" His mother cupped his face. They did. Everyone did. Even the judge. The boy nodded, but his eyes drifted back toward the courthouse doors. Inside, the officer sat alone in an empty hallway, the note still in his hand. He'd read it 4 times now. A shadow fell across the floor. He looked up. The prosecutor stood there, arms crossed. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the prosecutor sighed. "We're dropping the charges." The officer's breath caught. "What?" "The family's lawyer approached me during recess. They don't want to pursue this anymore." The prosecutor rubbed his temple. "And honestly? After hearing that kid? Neither do I." The officer opened his mouth, but no words came. The prosecutor gave him a long look. "You know this changes nothing about the bigger problems, right? One good moment doesn't fix a broken system." "I know," the officer said quietly. "But," the prosecutor added, turning to leave, "maybe it's a start." When court reconvened, the judge didn't even need to call for order. The room fell silent the moment he entered. He surveyed the room. "Before we proceed, I've been informed the plaintiffs wish to address the court." The boy's father stood, his wife's hand gripping his arm for strength. "Your Honor," he said, voice thick but clear, "we've decided to withdraw our complaint." A murmur swept through the courtroom. The judge raised a hand for silence. "May I ask why?" The man looked at his son, then at the officer. "Because today, we saw that justice isn't just about being right. It's about recognizing when people deserve second chances." He swallowed. "That officer helped our boy when he didn't have to. That matters more than anything else." The judge studied them for a long moment. Then, softly, "I agree." He turned to the jury. "Given this development, and given the extraordinary circumstances of this case, I'm dismissing all charges with prejudice." His gavel tapped once. "This court is adjourned." No one moved at first. Then, like a dam breaking, the room erupted, not in cheers, but in something quieter. A collective exhale. A release. The officer sat frozen as people began filing out. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt lost. Then a small hand touched his elbow. The boy stood beside him, eyes wide but no longer afraid. Behind him, his parents waited, watching but not intervening. The officer knelt, just like he had that night in the rain. "Thank you," the boy whispered. And for the first time in years, the officer cried. The courthouse steps were bathed in golden afternoon light as the boy's family emerged, squinting against the sudden brightness after hours under fluorescent lights. Reporters swarmed forward, microphones thrust out like weapons, but the boy's father shook his head firmly and wrapped a protective arm around his son's shoulders as they pushed through the crowd. Behind them, the officer stood in the doorway, watching them go. The crumpled thank you note was still clutched in his fist, the edges damp with sweat. He should have felt relieved, the case was over, his career intact, but instead his chest ached with something he couldn't name. A hand clapped his shoulder. His partner, who'd been sitting in the back row during the proceedings, gave him a wry smile. "Hell of a day, huh?" The officer didn't answer. Across the street, the boy paused at a bus stop and glanced back. For one suspended moment, their eyes met through the chaos of honking cars and shouting journalists. Then the bus doors hissed open, and the boy disappeared inside. That night, the officer sat on the edge of his bed, still in uniform, staring at the note now carefully smoothed out on his nightstand. His wife had cried when he showed it to her. His teenage daughter, who'd spent the last 2 years glaring at him through her eyeliner and shouting about police brutality, had gone very quiet before hugging him so hard his ribs hurt. He picked up his phone. Scrolled past the dozens of texts from colleagues. Hesitated. Then typed a number he'd memorized from the courtroom paperwork. "This is Officer Daniels. I just wanted to." He deleted it. Started again. Thank you for what your son did today. It changed. Deleted. The phone rang in his hand, startling him. Unknown number. Hello? A woman's voice, wary but determined. You kept my boy safe that night. I owe you more than thanks. The officer's breath caught. The boy's mother. He didn't know how she'd gotten his number, didn't care. Some truths didn't need explanations. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. Somewhere in the city, another crisis was unfolding. Another moment where someone would need help, or fear it. The officer gripped the phone tighter. Ma'am, His voice broke. I should have done more. A pause. Then, softer, come to dinner tomorrow. My son wants to show you his goldfish. Through the bedroom window, the first stars appeared between the city's light pollution. The officer realized he was crying again. Yes, he said. I'd like that. The officer stood awkwardly on the family's doorstep, shifting his weight between his polished shoes. He'd changed out of his uniform into a simple button-down shirt, but he still felt like he was wearing a costume. The scent of garlic and cumin drifted through the screen door, mixing with the sounds of laughter and a television playing cartoons. Before he could knock, the door swung open. The boy stood there, grinning, a bright orange goldfish swirling in a plastic bag clutched in his hands. You came. Behind him, his mother wiped her hands on a dish towel. Of course he did, she said, though her eyes betrayed her own surprise. Come in, officer. Please, he said, stepping inside, call me David. The apartment was small but warm, photos covering the fridge, homework spread across the kitchen table. The boy immediately dragged him to a fish tank in the corner where a single lonely fish circled. This is Bubbles. But he got sad being alone, so today we got him a friend. He held up the bag triumphantly. David knelt beside him, remembering another time he'd knelt to meet this child at eye level. That's a good name, he said, voice rough. The boy's father emerged from the kitchen, offering a firm handshake. There was a beat of hesitation, two men from different worlds, bound by a single moment of kindness, before the grip tightened into something real. Over steaming plates of biryani, the boy chattered about school and soccer while the adults danced around the unspoken things between them, the fear, the prejudice, the systems that should have made this dinner impossible. It was the boy who finally shattered the tension. Pointing his fork at David, he asked, "Why did you help me that night?" The room went still. David set down his water glass, the condensation wet against his palms. Because, he said slowly, when I was about your age, a cop helped me too. He traced the rim of his glass. My dad wasn't a good guy. One night, things got bad. An officer showed up, saw me hiding under the kitchen table, and instead of just doing his job, he sat with me until the ambulance came. Bought me a chocolate bar from the vending machine. He gave a small, sad smile. I never saw him again. But I never forgot. The boy's mother reached across the table, squeezing his wrist briefly before pulling away. No words were needed. After dessert, as David helped clear plates, the boy tugged his sleeve. Will you come to my school career day? To tell kids police can be heroes? The question hung in the air like a soap bubble, fragile, shimmering with hope. David looked at the family who'd welcomed him despite every reason not to. At the fish tank where Bubbles now circled joyfully with his new companion. Yes, he said. I'd like that very much. To be continued. Part 8 of 8, final, 1500 words. The elementary school auditorium buzzed with restless energy as children fidgeted in their seats. The boy, now proudly wearing a helper badge his teacher had given him that morning, kept twisting around to check the back doors. Are you sure he's coming? He whispered to his mother for the 10th time. Before she could answer, the doors swung open. Officer David Daniels stood framed in the doorway, not in uniform but in the same button-down shirt he'd worn to dinner, a folder of photos under one arm. The principal greeted him warmly, but his eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on the boy. A grin broke across his face. The boy shot both thumbs up. As David spoke to the students about community and kindness, showing pictures of police dogs and rescue scenarios, something unexpected happened. A small girl in the front row raised her hand. "My brother says cops are bad," she announced. The teacher stiffened, but David simply knelt, that same familiar motion, until he was at her eye level. "Your brother's not wrong to be careful," he said gently. "Some police have hurt people who didn't deserve it. That's why it's my job, our job, to be better." He glanced at the boy, then back at the children. "But you know what? You don't have to wait to grow up to make things better. Being kind when someone's scared? That's something you can do right now." Later, as the students swarmed around to see his badge, the boy's teacher approached, her eyes bright. "We've been trying to organize a community outreach program. Would you consider?" "Yes," David said immediately, watching as the boy high-fived his friends. "Whatever you need." Outside, spring sunlight dappled the playground where children shrieked and chased each other. The boy dragged David over to the monkey bars, chattering about how he was going to be a police officer and a marine biologist. David laughed, ruffling his hair. "You can be anything." The boy paused, suddenly serious. "You too." And in that moment, under a sky so blue it hurt, Officer David Daniels, the man who'd spent years hardening his heart to survive the job, felt something inside him crack open and begin to heal. The school bell rang, signaling the end of career day, but none of the children moved. They remained clustered around Officer Daniels, their small hands reaching out to touch his badge, their voices overlapping with endless questions. "Have you ever arrested a bad guy? Do police dogs get treats? My uncle says all cops are mean, is that true?" David answered each one patiently, his eyes occasionally flickering to the boy who had brought him here. The child stood proudly beside him, beaming as if he'd personally arranged this whole event. When the principal finally ushered the students back to class, the boy lingered. "You were the best speaker ever," he declared. David crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's eye level, just as he had on that rainy night months ago. "No, you're the brave one," he said softly. "You stood up in court and told the truth. That's harder than anything I've ever done." The boy's mother approached, her eyes shining. "We should get going," she said gently, placing a hand on her son's shoulder. But then she hesitated. "Unless, you'd like to join us for ice cream?" David's heart swelled. A year ago, no, a month ago, he would have made an excuse. Too much paperwork. Too many responsibilities. But now? Now he understood what really mattered. "I'd love to," he said. The ice cream parlor was crowded and noisy, filled with laughing families and sticky-handed children. David watched as the boy carefully deliberated between chocolate and strawberry, finally choosing both in a swirl cone. As they sat at a small table by the window, the boy's mother turned to David. "You know, after everything that happened, I never thought I'd trust a police officer again." She took a deep breath. "But you proved me wrong." David stirred his coffee absently. "I wish that were enough," he admitted. "One good cop doesn't fix a broken system." "No," she agreed. "But it's a start. And starts matter." The boy, his face now smeared with ice cream, looked between them. "Are you friends now?" David met the mother's eyes. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a shared hope for a better future. "Yeah," David said, reaching over to wipe chocolate off the boy's chin. "Yeah, I think we are." Months passed. David kept his promises. He volunteered at the school, helping with their new community outreach program. He mentored rookies at the precinct, teaching them that being a good officer meant more than just enforcing the law, it meant seeing the people behind the incidents. And every other Sunday, without fail, he had dinner with the boy and his family. One evening, as they sat around the table, the boy now proudly showing off his latest school project, the fish tank bubbling happily in the corner, David realized something. This was what change looked like. Not grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but quiet moments of connection. A shared meal. A listening ear. A simple act of kindness on a rainy night. The boy, noticing David's thoughtful expression, tilted his head. "What are you thinking about?" David smiled. "Just how lucky I am." And as laughter filled the small apartment, mixing with the sounds of the city outside, the truth settled over him like a warm blanket. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let your heart be softened. Sometimes the most powerful act of justice was choosing to see each other's humanity. And sometimes, just sometimes, a single moment of compassion could change everything.